We spent the morning, as most of you know, doing a little bit of background about how did Europe find its way to this point, where are we now, and how does Europe get out of this mess, one way or another. I think the panel that you just heard was a little bit about what markets are thinking. Are markets going to be constructive and patient and give the politicians as long as they want, or are markets going to rush their hand? We're happy, I'm personally honored to have George Shultz be on stage with us. Full disclosure, I met George 24 years ago when I showed up as a freshman at Stanford. And not only by that time had he been Secretary of State and Treasury and Secretary of Labor and Director of OMB, but he has been, for most of us, a great teacher, a great leader here at Stanford, and for folks in the US who have been operating under many of his theses, many of his policies for a long time. And I thought what we wanted to do today, George, is just give you an opportunity to share your perspectives on Europe, both from the founding of this experiment to the choices that they have now. So with that, George, thank you very much for joining us.
I think in Europe, as well as throughout the world, we have the difficult fundamental problem of governing over diversity in a world that has changed and keeps changing fairly rapidly. I'll just mention two of the changes that are affecting everybody. It's true throughout most of the developed world and much of the developing world that fertility is falling, in some cases way below the replacement rate, and longevity is rising. So populations are getting older, and largely, as of say 10 or 15 years ago, unanticipated. So the face of the world is changing radically. Then I don't think anybody truly can appreciate the depth of the meaning of the information and communication revolution. It means that people everywhere can know most anything important fairly easily, and that they can communicate with each other and organize. It used to be that those in charge had a semi-monopoly of information and a practical monopoly on ability to organize. That's not true. It changes the problem of governance, and particularly when you think of diversity, it makes it especially difficult. That's what is being faced around the world and in Europe. And I don't think they are conceiving of the problem right, and therefore not handling it. I don't know what was covered in your review of the past, but let me review it for you as I see it. At the end of World War II, some gifted people, mostly in the United States, but also Britain, gradually in Japan and Germany as they came back to life, and in Europe in some special ways, people looked back. And what did they see? They saw two world wars. The first was settled on rather vindictive terms that helped lead to the second one. In the Second World War, 70 million people were killed, civilian and military. 70 million people. They saw the Great Depression. They saw the protectionism and the competitive devaluations, all of which contributed to the Depression and also to the kind of sense of isolation that helped lead to the war. They saw the Holocaust. They said to themselves, what a crummy world. And they also said to themselves, whatever happens around the world, it affects us. So we better try to design something better. Then it began to dawn on people that the Soviet Union was a heavily armed, aggressive adversary, and the Cold War emerged. So in that environment, there developed the concept of containment, the institution of NATO, and the World Bank and the IMF to deal with currency and development problems. Remember, the World Bank originally was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was aimed at reconstructing what had been demolished before it was a poverty-oriented institution. So piece by piece, gradually, there developed what amounted to an economic and security commons constructed that we in the United States benefited from, Europe benefited from, everybody benefited from it. I was fascinated back in the early 80s when I'm visiting China and talking with Deng Xiaoping. He lectured me on how important it was to, in effect, he didn't put it this way, maintain this commons because China was now ready to open. It had the two openings, to China within China and to the outside world. Meanwhile, in Europe, people are making the same observations, but in a more intimate way. In a sense, how do we contain Germany in something bigger so that we avoid the problems of the past? So they began to look for things that signified Europe. After all, these individual nation states were relatively homogeneous groups. You put it all together in Europe and you have heterogeneity. But nevertheless, they wanted things that were Europe. There was originally the coal and steel community. That worked. It was a positive development. They could see that as long as they were individual countries with trade barriers and so on, they were at a disadvantage economically. And so the common market emerged. And that worked because a bigger trading area led to all kinds of economies of scale and so on. And it was a positive thing, it worked. Then they developed the European monetary system. My friends Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt had a lot to do with it. And as I'm vaguely remembering, it had a tunnel, that is some loosely related currencies, and then a snake in the tunnel for harder relationships. And that worked. Then, as the Cold War ended, and they're still trying to maintain a sense of Europe, on the security side, it didn't go very well. Here we had the problems in the Balkans, horrible problems in the Balkans. Peter Carrington negotiated some sort of a deal. The Germans didn't like it. They pulled the rug out from under it. So here we had in Europe a devastating set of events, and it wasn't settled until the United States came in and set the Serbs back, and you wound up with the Dayton Agreement that more or less held. So they were not able to govern over diversity in a security sense. More recently, we've had Libya. Britain and France wanted to intervene, the Germans didn't. But it also exhibited the fact that defense capabilities have been allowed to run down so much that they ran out of ammunition. If it hadn't been for the US, as somebody inelegantly put it, leading from behind, it wouldn't have worked. Meanwhile, in the economic arena, they designed the euro. I can remember a meeting in Berlin, and John, you were there, of financiers and economists. It was, I think, 3 or 4 months before the euro was introduced. And everybody was arguing against it, that this was something that couldn't work. That is, if you have a bunch of disparate economic units and you throw a fixed exchange rate over the top of them, in the end, it's not going to work. There has to be some flexibility. And I remember Helmut Kohl came to the meeting, and he listened to this, and then he got up in all of his girth, and he said, the decision has been made. It's a matter of war and peace. It's up to you to make it work, and he left. Well, it didn't work. Hardly anything that's happened wasn't predicted, because you tried to, whereas the common market worked. I remember the agricultural policy. Helmut Schmidt came when he was in office. He's been my friend. And I gathered a few of the usual suspects around here in economics, and we had a seminar with him. And everybody was attacking the common agricultural policy. And finally he said, I agree, it's a terrible policy, but it's the only thing we have that we can call Europe. So it was this need, desire, and I can understand it. And I think it is a huge achievement to have this sense of Europe. But then to make Europe work, you have to say to yourself, we're governing over diversity. German population is relatively homogeneous, same with France, same with Italy. They're not the same, though. Italians are not like Germans. That's reality. So you have to figure out how you govern over diversity. And while you look for things that unify people, you also have to be careful that you recognize the diversity. It's instructive to remember what Thomas Jefferson said when he was arguing for freedom of religion in the United States and the separation of church and state. He said, remember, divided we stand. So you have to recognize that in a heterogeneous society, there are divisions, and you have to recognize them and honor them. In San Francisco, 20% of the population is ethnic Chinese, and we have Chinatown. It's fine. We have a first-generation Chinese-American mayor now, and he's a terrific mayor, and he governs over the whole city well. He's not a China mafia. But San Francisco works in this sense because it's very diverse, and it allows the diversity to express itself. And Europe was doing well on that score. The common agricultural policy was at odds with the diversity, but it worked because, after all, farmers were benefiting, and that goes well politically everywhere. And it wasn't that important relative to the big picture. But the euro, the exchange rate system, is important. And now we're in the position of saying, instead of having currency cross rates change to accommodate changes, we're telling people that they have to take 20% cuts in pay. Sorry, folks, that doesn't go. That's politically explosive, as we can see. And it's not necessary. There are ways. The European monetary system worked well. So what we now see is a kind of scrambling, rambling business with all kinds of ideas put up, and all of the ideas in the end wind up meaning the Germans should give some money to people. And it's different ways of phrasing it and constructing it, but that's what it comes down to. And after a while, that runs out of steam. And the austerity prescriptions tell people to tear their societies apart when they are already overcommitted because of the aging societies. They've made too many promises already which they can't keep, just as we have in the United States. I mean, look at California. We're in a hell of a shape for that reason. So I think in Europe, they have to say to themselves, we are accustomed to governing over homogeneous populations, Germany, Italy, France, Netherlands, so on. And it's essential that we create this sense of Europe. But we have to remember that we have to change our mindset. As soon as we say Europe, we're governing over heterogeneity. So the things that we seek to stand for what we have in common cannot be things at odds with the diverse nature of our population. And when we do it on a grand scale, we're going to get in trouble, and we have to figure out how to undo it. If I were in Europe right now, or advising them, or active in any way, which I'm not at all, but if I were, I would be saying to them, somehow you have to unwind this mistake. And if the notion of the euro is so embedded that it's impossible to get rid of it, well then change it and kind of make it resemble the European monetary system that Schmidt and Giscard gave you. And have a soft euro and a hard euro, or some way of recognizing that there's got to be a method for rearranging the furniture other than causing people to do things that are practically impossible to do. When there is at hand a tried and true mechanism, the exchange rate system, that has worked well over many years and helps to solve these problems. Meanwhile, on the security front, I think Europe has to decide whether it really wants to be a player and what stakes it has, because the Balkan exhibit and the Libyan exhibit show that if you say there's going to be a European defense force, give me a break. It's not there. There's the capability isn't there, the dedication isn't there, the willpower isn't there. From the United States standpoint, our stake is high, but I don't think Europe can continue to expect that the United States is going to bail them out. We're having a hard enough time bailing ourselves out. So we have to not only in Europe look at those things, but I think we in the United States also have to work with our friends, and our friends are heavily in Europe, and how we put back together again the economic and security commons which we achieved, but which is, for various reasons, coming apart at the seams right now. That's the task.
George, thank you. So allow me to ask a first question. Folks that have questions for George, if they can go to either of the two microphones. George,
I have to speak up because my hearing, and now I'm in my 90s, my hearing is not as good as it used to be.
So George, I take from your discussion today that the market's preoccupation with what does Brussels decide about X, how does Frankfurt and Berlin decide Y, what does Mario Draghi do at the ECB, that those are consequential. But am I right in hearing from you that you think that it's the recipients of all of this transfer who are probably none too pleased to be feeling austerity without any growth, that there's more risk for markets, that the recipients of the good graces of Northern Europe might say this might be working for you, but it's not working for me? Is that more where market participants and policymakers should be worried if there's a sharp
Kevin, I don't think
upsurge?
it's working for anybody right now. That's the problem. And you mentioned Brussels and Frankfurt. I mean, here we have these nation states, they have capitals. And a portion of their sovereignty has been assigned to Brussels. Trade policy, which includes immigration policy. Then a portion of their sovereignty has been assigned to Frankfurt, monetary policy. As I read some of the things that are now being proposed, bank regulatory policy will be assigned to Frankfurt. And before long, they're talking about somehow having some sort of a central government will have some control over spending and taxation. What do you have left as a sovereign government? Who's responsible? Where do you look? If you're going to make a deal, as Henry Kissinger once said, tell me the right phone number. Who do I call? Sovereignty is dispersed. And therefore, it's not as responsible as it could be and should be. I won't take a question from Bob Hall. He's too smart for me. You have to give the answer as well as the question, Bob.
Actually, I'm only going to give you the answer. It seems to me, first of all, I think you're overstating the importance of aging, because there's no better example than you of how older people are highly productive these days. I think that the increased productivity has more than offset the aging effect. The problem in Europe is not a problem of the aging of the population. It's essentially forced retirement at ridiculously early ages. There's a whole set of European labor institutions that pushes people, keeps young people out of the labor market until they're in their 30s, and then pushes them out of the labor market when they're in their 50s. I mean, when you compare these, the labor force participation in Europe of 45-year-olds is the same as it is in the US, but it's extremely much lower at young ages and older ages. So Europe needs to harness the productive potential of its aging population and not treat it as a harm.
Well, that's certainly true, but the fact that the aging population continues to age is part of the problem. Because a lot of these things were put into effect when people thought longevity was much less than it is. So there is a holdover problem from and a need to reconceptualize the pension problems. And I completely agree with you that we need to figure out how to organize them so they encourage people to stay in the labor force. But we're building a gigantic problem, not only in Europe, but here in the United States, because the unemployment rates for young people are so terribly high. And it's at these early ages when you learn your basic labor force skills. And a lot of people aren't learning them. So we're building problems for the future by this.
So my second comment is your belief that that a soft currency would be the answer to the problems of Southern Europe. And I debated this. That seems to be the conventional view, that the Greeks would very happily accept the necessary 30% reduction in real wages that Greece absolutely must go through. They'll accept it happily if they're paid in depreciated drachmas, which no longer buy nearly as many goods as they used to buy with the same number of euros. And I don't see any obvious basis for that at all. Historically, there's been lots of examples in which large changes in nominal wages have occurred as necessary to get real wages in line. Tom Sargent has written very effectively on this point. We're looking at the world with blinders very typically when we say, oh, well, nobody will ever accept a reduction in nominal wages, because lots of people have. My father was on the faculty at Stanford in the 1930s, took a substantial reduction in nominal wages, like everybody did in the US. So I think that you're overselling. Everyone thinks that, oh, it would be really, really easy, especially in Greece, if they would just go to the drachma. And I think that the amount of social dislocation that would occur by going to the drachma and forcing real wages down would be about the same as if they did it on the euro. It would be, of course, it's going to be bad in both cases. There's irreversible harm that was caused by the...
That may be, Bob, but it would be a Greek problem and not a Europe problem. That's the difference.
Well, okay, but as a citizen of the world, do we make a distinction there? I care about
You're saying that you got to get away from the notion that one size fits all. and recognize there is diversity. You don't deny that Italians aren't like Germans and Greeks aren't like Frenchmen. These are different people, have different cultures and different outlooks.
Excuse me.
And you have to give room for that to express itself.
All the people you're talking about use the metric system with complete pleasure. There isn't the slightest inclination for the Italians to have their own measurement system just because I agree, obviously the Italians are different than the Germans, but they're very happy to cooperate on using the metric system.
Well, I can't argue with you because you're too good for me, but if what you're arguing is just rock along, everything's going great, I'd say, wait a minute, things aren't going great. There's a mess, and it isn't getting better. And the kinds of proposals to reduce sovereignty further, diffuse responsibility more, seem to me to be going in the wrong direction.
So next question will go to Lorenzo, who recently finished his service at the European Central Bank, and will have a tough question, I'm sure.
No, I thought your concepts are very interesting, the two difficult issues to manage. The speed of information and the diversity. Now, diversity is not a concept which does not change through history. As you were mentioning Chinatown, I don't remember when the Chinese got to vote in the US, but probably 100 years ago, I don't know if they were allowed to vote, probably 150 years ago they weren't, and many others were not. And I think the US went through a civil war because people were not the same and could not manage diversity. If I think about my son, he's 13, I don't think that he feels that different from a German kid of 13 or even a US kid. So probably there are diversities, but from an economic point of view, in this global world, the concept of diversity is much lower, I think. So probably we, of the aging part of the society, have a concept.
Man, I can see looking at you.
Have a concept of diversity which is different from the young people. So I think that's a challenge for Europe, I think, which wants to integrate. One of the most successful things we have in Europe, for instance, is that it's called Erasmus. People go and study abroad because this kind of generation, they feel much more European to some extent. But that was more of a comment. You say that the EMS worked. Well, in fact, it didn't really work. I was talking this morning about how in an integrated monetary system, you have to choose an hegemon. The dollar was in the Bretton Woods, it still is to some extent. In Europe, you would have had to choose an hegemon, and the Deutschmark was the obvious. So the key question was, could Europe survive in its economic integration process with the Deutschmark being the hegemon? That's a political issue, I think. And it's an economic issue. And there are many examples where, for instance, Mitterrand had to change his policy because he could not stick up to the Deutschmark. So managing together a currency is pretty tough because it imposes then a superstructure that forces changes in behavior. But the alternative, I would not agree with you that the alternative is necessarily much better. And you mentioned at the beginning of your speech the people after World War II looking backwards. And you quoted yourself the competitive devaluations of the 30s, trying to beg their neighbor policy to get out of the crisis. So I don't know what would have happened in this crisis if all the countries started to devalue and to regain competitiveness. I'm not sure it would have been a better world in Europe. So these are just a few comments for you to react.
Well, you don't think that what I've said would lead to a better world, but the world you've created is a downright mess. So it couldn't be worse. And The EMS came into place after the Bretton Woods system ended. Remember, it ended because while it worked for a long period after World War II, remembering that we came out of World War II with the United States economy the only one left standing. So we could basically sort of stand there. And in effect, it wasn't a fixed exchange rate system. Everybody else devalued against us. And that went on for a long time. And President Nixon did not decide to close the gold window. The gold window was closed because there were so many more dollars out there to be redeemed at $35 an ounce, and a run was beginning. So the market closed the gold window, in effect. And that meant that you had to design a different kind of system. And I was intimately involved in that. I remember I was director of the budget when all this happened. And I kept asking the Treasury people what their plan was, and they told me it was a secret. And then I became Secretary of the Treasury, and I said, okay, what's the plan? They said, we don't have one. I said, that's what I thought. So I spent the summer of 1972 designing one. Of course, everybody wanted stability, the par value system. And I thought that you had to have some flexibility. So I had some interesting conversations with my friend Milton Friedman. And we designed, and Paul Volcker had the laboring oar in doing this. We designed a flexible exchange rate system in the clothing of a par value system. That, as we said, you set par values, and they change automatically when reserve balances change. And I remember it was quite a struggle to get this out of the US government. And I took it over to President Nixon. He was going to give a speech at the World Bank IMF meetings. And I said, here's your speech, Mr. President. He looked at it, he said, that's not my speech, that's your speech. So when he addressed, he said, tomorrow my Secretary of the Treasury will unveil the US approach. What a hype that was. But I had done something that hadn't been done before, and it wound up paying off very well. I invited the finance ministers of the leading countries, Germany, France, Britain, Japan, to come in individually, and I showed them the speech and asked them to comment. And nobody tried to mess with the basic structure of the speech. They all made suggestions of wording and nuance that helped, and I managed to take all their suggestions. And then we formed a little group. And nobody wanted the big countries to be telling them what to do, but we had the G20, which was totally unmanageable. So everybody wanted us to meet, and nobody wanted to know it. So I had a meeting, and the president said, I'm not going to be in town, so why don't you give your meeting a little class and put it in the White House? So we met in the library of the White House, which is a beautiful room with a nice fireplace, and they served a good meal, and so on. And we had to figure out a way to refer to our group that didn't disclose what it was. So we decided to call it the Library Group. It subsequently became reasonably famous in these circles. But the result was that the finance ministers of these countries, we got to know each other very well, became good friends, still friends today. And we were able to work through this. And I remember the EMS, Schmidt and Giscard, at one of our meetings, took me aside and they said what they were planning to do, to give something more European, and to give a greater sense of stability. And you said it didn't work. My impression was it worked pretty well. And I remember, for example, Britain got into terrible trouble and they basically just had to withdraw. It wasn't a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal for Britain, but it didn't disrupt things badly. So in a sense, it allowed for things to go wrong, and when things go wrong somewhere, it doesn't mess up everything. So I thought it went along pretty well, and it was European. So it served those purposes. But I certainly agree with Bob Hall. There's a lot of reform that could be done that would be very helpful. And I think in this country as well as in Europe, the fact that unemployment is so high among young people is a very ominous development because it has huge implications for the future.
Question.
I'm Faith Wittriall. You published earlier this year a sort of a short essay over at CEPR, and in it you were explaining why the U.S. needed to show more leadership relative to the past. And one of the things you mentioned was that Treasury Secretary over in Europe for meetings, and the Austrian minister said to him, "Why should I listen to you silly people?" So with that question of yours in mind, my question is, if we solve the fiscal cliff before or after Christmas, and we get to, through first quarter of next year here in the U.S., what else can we do better here to get Europe not to listen to us, but to at least consider some of the good advice that drifts over? What should we do better to have more authority and be more persuasive? That's my question.
Well, I think the problems that we have are blindingly obvious, and the solutions are blindingly obvious. And our problem is, how do we find our way to solve them? And it seems to me, and we had this problem, I'm maybe overemphasizing my experience, but I was the chairman of Ronald Reagan's Economic Advisory Panel in the campaign and then for the first year and a half of his presidency. So I watched this process. And broadly speaking, what he did was to put in place a set of policies consistent with economic growth without inflation. And he took a beating in doing it. In other words, he thought strategically. That is, we all thought, he agreed, that we couldn't have a decent economy with the kind of inflation we had. Remember, it was in the teens. And Paul Volcker was there, ready to do and doing what needed to be done at the Fed. And people kept running into the president saying, "Mr. President, he's doing these things. You're going to have a recession, you're going to have unemployment, we're going to lose seats in the midterm election. You got to do something about it." He never did. He basically held a political umbrella over Paul. I talked to Paul the other day about it. He was my undersecretary when I was secretary, so I know the high quality that he brings. He said, yes, he remembered that during press conferences, Reagan was served up questions by the press constantly to criticize him, and he never did. So anyway, he knowingly took a beating. There was a recession. We did lose seats in the midterm election. However, by the time the end of 1982 arrived, early 83, inflation was under control. And the basically tax incentives that were put in place kicked in, and the economy took off like a bird. Now, I think the same thing can happen now, basically. That is, although we have built ourselves a set of problems that are daunting. I wrote something in the Wall Street Journal the other day with some Hoover Institution colleagues that tried to point out how big the problems are that have been created here now for us. But I believe that if we reform the personal income tax system along the lines of the 1986 Tax Act, that's step one. And goodness, that can be done. It was Reagan's proposal. It worked its way through. Treasury people scored it and so on, but basically it got into the hands of the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. Very well respected, I suppose they still are, and they were then. Anyway, by the time we got through, it was introduced in the House by Dick Gebhardt and the Senate by Bill Bradley. Passed the Senate 97-3. 97-3. And Reagan was asked if it bothered him that 2 Democrats introduced his legislation. You know what he said? It passed, didn't it? We don't have that kind of governance anymore. We've got to get back to that kind of governance. Then I think and everybody knows the personal income tax system needs it. The corporate income tax is too high. Everybody knows that. And there are these preferences in there where GE manages not to pay any tax. So let's get rid of those things and fix it so everybody pays the tax, whatever it is. And it could be a lot lower. Then you have to do something about the entitlement problems. Everybody knows that. It's not a mystery that we can't go on with these wildly escalating costs. With Social Security, it's an absolute piece of cake. If you change the indexing from wage indexing to price indexing, and maybe index when the age of full benefits hits 67, index it to longevity, very gradual, you'll have a solvent Social Security system. It'll take a while. People say it's solvent until such and such a time, meaning that the trust fund can carry it. Thanks a lot, there is no trust fund. The money has been spent. It's just a big bunch of IOUs. So the general treasury is going to have to pay that bill for a while. But if you make these reforms, Social Security can be on a self-sustaining basis. And I think in the healthcare area, first of all, I think there's a lot of technology coming at it, if you will use it right. But also, you have to get the consumer in the game. And when you react to rising costs with wage and price controls, you're going to have less of what you control. It's an absolute certainty that if you put a control on the price, you're going to get less of it. So we don't want a system that produces less healthcare providers when we're expanding demand.
So if we tackle
We need to have in the healthcare area universal coverage. Let's start with that proposition.
So if we tackle these 3 small things, maybe Europe will begin to listen to us. Is that?
So those are some things we could do. Personally, I think that the country desperately needs a thoughtful infrastructure program. Our infrastructure is falling apart. We shouldn't think of it as a counter-cyclical matter. We should think of it as a long-term investment. There are lots of things that need to be done, and should put that into place. And then, my goodness, we have to get a Federal Reserve that will be a rules-based Federal Reserve. They have a balance sheet now. I don't know how they're going to unwind it, frankly. Kevin's responsible for that. He got out as soon as he could, but you have created a terrible mess, Kevin. And now Ben Bernanke is saying it's a great thing for the world that emerging economies are being forced to intervene in their currencies to keep them from rising so much because of the influx of money the Fed has created, which is going to those places looking for higher yield. Give me a break. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. And we could do these things that I'm talking about, and we'd have some pain and agony for a while, but then the economy would take off like a bird. It's there.
George, thank you very much. George has an engagement in San Francisco, but we really appreciate his time on Europe and the rest of the world.
Well, I have an engagement in San Francisco, and it's very important. The Christopher Stevens, there's going to be a big ceremony in his honor at City Hall. And as a former Secretary of State, I want to be there and speak. But when we think of public service, and we think of the Foreign Service and what they do, this man was a giant. It's interesting that you see in Libya, the Libyans holding up signs saying, "Thank you, Chris." They understood it. It was a deliberately planned attack, probably Al-Qaeda oriented, that killed him. But he was a fantastic person. Over at Hoover, we have these national security fellows there at the colonel level, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, State Department, come new ones each year. And we had a meeting of them, and the Army guy said he'd been stationed in Libya. So I said, "Did you know Chris Stevens?" He said, "Everybody knew Chris Stevens. He was fluent in Arabic. He was everywhere. He was so constructive. He was a centerpiece." And if you talk about what it takes to rebuild a decent world, this is the kind of person it takes. So it's a tremendous tragedy that we've lost him. And my wife has organized this ceremony in City Hall, and I don't know how many people will come, but my guess is there'll be a good turnout. But we want to express to his family that'll be there our grief. So I'm wearing all this dark clothing. But I also wanted to express, in a sense, our celebration of his achievements. It's not enough just to grieve, but also to pay our respects to what he was able to achieve on behalf not only of the United States, but civilized people around the world. The mission in Libya was a broadly spaced one. So that's where I'm going. So most of you in my questions said you didn't like what I had to propose for Europe, but all you seem to propose is more of the same, and frankly, more of the same isn't working. If you keep doing the same thing that doesn't work all the time, that's the definition of insanity. So come on.
Thank you very much.